Good evening, and welcome back to day 15 of the Bible in 365. Today we're taking a look at Genesis chapter 42, starting in verse 29, and going until Genesis chapter 45, ending in verse 15. Now let's get started. The second half of Genesis 42 tell us that Joseph's brothers make it back to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan. It also tells us that they needed to recount to him what has happened, including the need for them to take Benjamin to Egypt to rescue Simeon. As they're unloading their sacks of grain, they discover their money pouches, and the entirety of the family is frightened. At this point, Jacob states that his life is ruined and that the odds are essentially stacked against him. The biblical text also informs us that Jacob denies Reuben's request to take Benjamin to Egypt, despite the fact that Reuben offered the lives of his two sons as collateral. Essentially, Jacob was on his last thread, and one more loss would kill him. Picking up in chapter 43, Chapter 43 tells us that that some time had passed and that the family has gone through all the grain that they had purchased in Egypt. So Jacob tells the brothers to go and buy some more food. At this point, Judah reminds his father that they can't return to Egypt without Benjamin and offers his own life as collateral for that of Benjamin's. Now Israel relents, and he sends them with the best of products of the land as a gift, hoping that they will find favor with the Egyptian official, who is Joseph. So the brothers arrive with Benjamin in Egypt, and Joseph is happy to see them, and he has one of his servants take his brothers to his house where they're going to have lunch with him. Now the brothers at this point are freaking out, thinking that Joseph is upset and is going to attack them. So they quickly apologize to the steward of Joseph's house and try to repay him for their perceived debt of the silver that they found in their sacks from their last journey. Now at this point, the steward of Joseph's house calms them down and he brings them out Simeon. At this point, they travel to Joseph's house, they wash up, and they get ready for lunch. Joseph comes home, they present him with gifts, and here one of Joseph's dreams is fulfilled. They bow down before him. Now, Joseph then spends some time asking about their health and about the health of their father. And somewhere in this conversation, this pleasantries, Joseph has a moment with Benjamin and is overwhelmed by emotion, and so he goes into a private room and weeps. Eventually, Joseph comes back out, he returns to his company, and they have lunch. Now, the seating arrangement was a little bit awkward due to customs of the day. The Egyptians and Hebrews could not sit together, so they sat apart, and Joseph couldn't sit with either group. He himself, being a Hebrew, couldn't sit with the Egyptians, but his brothers, thinking he was an Egyptian, he couldn't sit with the Hebrews, so he sat at his own table apart from both groups. Now here it's important to note that Joseph's brothers were seated in the order of their ages. This shows that Joseph knew them well, and it's just an interesting fact that the biblical text decides to give us. Now, the story continues in chapter 44. At this point, Joseph instructs his stewards to fill the men's sacks to the brim with food and to put silver back into their sacks. He also has instructed his steward to place his special drinking goblet, his cup, into Benjamin's luggage. Now morning comes, and Joseph's brothers leave and head home. At this point, Joseph sends his steward to confront them. Joseph's steward asks them why they repaid good with evil. In other words, he's accusing them of wrongdoing. And the brothers say they've done nothing wrong, and they pledge their lives on it. So they decide they're going to open up their luggage as proof, and of course the steward finds Joseph's cup in Benjamin's sack. At this point, the brothers tore their clothes in anger, grief, and mourning, and they head back to the city. They return to Joseph's house, and they ask him how he's able to discover all these things, if he practices divination. like if he's a mediator or a wise man or has dreams or is, a magician or sorcerer. And so at this point, Joseph's brothers pledge their innocence to him, but they submit themselves as slaves to Joseph. Joseph says he only wants the one who was found with the cup to remain as a slave, and the rest can return to their father. At this point, Judah speaks up and recounts their interactions with Joseph in Egypt from their first encounter, and then also their interactions with their father and the conversations they've had with him regarding their time in Egypt. And so he tells Joseph ultimately that his father would die if the youngest doesn't return, and so Judah offers himself in the place of Benjamin. Now, moving forward to chapter 45 tells us that Joseph can no longer control himself, so he orders everyone to leave. Now, at this point in time, Joseph bursts out in tears and he wept. Joseph decides to reveal his true identity as Joseph to his brothers, and he inquires about his father, but they're too terrified to answer him. They're probably still trying to figure out who. He says he's Joseph, what? And so they're a bit confused and afraid. And so at this, Joseph tells his brothers to come close, perhaps so they could identify him for themselves. And he recounts the provision of God in all their actions, and them selling him to slavery, and God using that ultimately to provide for all of Egypt. Now, Joseph then tells them to move their entire households down to Egypt so that he could still provide for them, because it's only 2 years into the famine and there's 5 years to remain. And so he tells them, to bring my family back to Egypt, bring the entire family back, and bring dad back, bring our father back. Now, after this, he hugs his brother Benjamin and kisses all his brothers. And then in verse 15, it tells us something very significant. In verse 15, it tells us that his brothers talked with him. This is significant because it contrasts Genesis 37:4, where it states that Joseph's brothers hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. And so it's a complete 180. They go from not being able to speak to speaking. Now, folks, it is here that we end our reading for today. Our story will pick back up tomorrow as we take a look at Genesis chapter 45, beginning in verse 16, and exploring all the way to Genesis chapter 48, ending in verse 7. As always, folks, God bless.